What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you episode 5 of our Divinity Original Sin walkthrough full story of sorts. So in our previous episode, we rescued Icara from Hiberheim and the clutches of King Boreas, and she filled us in on some of the story, again, as you can see in the previous episode, if you so choose. But right now, she directs us to the Luculla Mines, where her sister Leandra, otherwise known as the Conduit, has been stockpiling resources, and where she took off to after she fueled the massive bloodstone she got from Hiberheim. At the beginning of this series, I mentioned that I wasn't going to cover a lot of side quests. However, for this particular part of the game, I would be remiss not to cover about 3 of them right here. So the entire point of covering them in this particular instance is the fact that they give us context into what we're walking into in the mine. So nearby where Icara's hut was and we entered Hiberheim is actually the town of Silverglen, which truthfully, if you were playing the game, you probably would have been to already. So there are about 3 particular side quests that we can pick up in town that give us context to what is going on at the mines before we actually head over there. We can speak to a woman named Nadia and find out that her husband died of a disease called the rot. And she believes that the head of the Miners Guild, Lawrence, at least here in town, not the entire guild, knew that the substance they were mining in those mines, known as tenebrium, was causing the rot and basically told the miners to keep mining anyway, and she feels that her husband died as a result of Lawrence's oversight, and she asks us to prove this. Also, if we speak to Lawrence directly, we can find out that the mine has recently been taken over by goblins, forcing everyone out. So he would like us to go into the mines and basically figure out what's going on with these goblins and ideally get rid of them. And then lastly, we can talk to a third guy. This is actually probably the least important, but talking to these guys does give us the cage we need, which I'll get to in just a second. Brandon, who we will meet when talking to Lawrence, because he's talking to Lawrence when we walk up for the first time, asks us to go into the mine and fetch some tenebrium for him to basically sell for his retirement plan. And he also gives us a bloodstone cage, or some sort of chest, basically. Now this cage we get to keep even after the quest is over, and it allows us to safely transport tenebrium items, because as I mentioned just a second ago, and as the miners told us, tenebrium causes a disease called the rot. That is not just a gimmick. If your character uses tenebrium items without tenebrium resistance, you will straight up get the rot. It's a very real thing that has to be then cured. It's a whole thing. So avoid getting it. It sucks. So with that out of the way, we can go ahead and head towards the mine. So we do this by heading through the forest slightly north of Icara's cabin down a different path. Now this will take us into several orc patrols. Now, when we kill all these guys, I believe it's possible to charm your way through them, but for the most part, you're going to kill them. So once we kill all these orcs, we can actually find orders from one Grutilda from Hunter's Edge. Now, again, if you'd been playing the game yourself, you would have heard Hunter's Edge come up a couple times here and there before this. And basically, it is a town to the east that was recently taken over by orcs. And we'll get to it later, but basically this is just some foreshadowing for later, these orc tribes that we're fighting in the forest on our way to the mines. So once we do that, we actually come up on some goblins. Now, from right at this point, there is a very long gauntlet to the entrance of the mines that is crowded with orcs. Now, the game actually recommends that you sneak by them subtly. Like when you come up to the first one, your characters will be like, oh, we could probably sneak past this guy, just kind of out loud ambiently. So that said, very viable option, but basically, you'd be skipping a ton of experience if you did that, so personally, I prefer to kill all of them, which I did. But once you get to the end of the gauntlet here, as I like to call it, and to the entrance to the mines, you find out that it's actually the Immaculates who are in charge of the mine and not the goblins, because you see the goblins speaking to an Immaculate just outside the entrance asking where their leader is and why they haven't seen him in a while. The goblins, that is, which obviously implies some level of cooperation between the two. Now, we unfortunately don't get to follow up on this conversation yet, as approaching them does start combat, and we have to kill all of them. Now, once we get inside the mines, we'll be kind of notified over to a barrel hiding spot where we can meet a man named Milkus. Milkus is awesome because he gives us a ton of context as to what is happening. Milkus explains that Lawrence actually hired these goblins that are in the mine. The goblins pretended to be immune to rot, so Lawrence thought he could hire them, and then they would mine the tenebrium being immune to the rot. However, once the goblins got control of the mine, they immediately handed it over to the Immaculates, because the Immaculates are actually employing the goblins because the goblin leader, Satacondris, who we'll learn about here in just a second, is actually looking to learn more about the Bloodstones, and the conduit basically promised him knowledge for his help. The orcs that raided Hunter's Edge that I just mentioned a little bit ago actually gave the citizens of Hunter's Edge to the Immaculates, well, to the goblins specifically, as slaves, and the goblins gave those citizens again to the Immaculates, and the Immaculates have turned them all into the undead. So when we see these undead enchanted miners here in the mine, that's how they got here. The Immaculates have been basically killing them and raising them as servants, because obviously the undead don't, have to worry about the rot either. Now, from here, if we destroy the cave-in to our left, we can actually head up around to the side and meet some Immaculate members. Now, it's possible to persuade them that you are friendly, and they'll basically give you a little more context, but honestly, even if you kill them, you'll get basically the same information. So basically, all these guys are protecting this bone totem. Now, this bone totem is what they are using to control all of the undead miners. So if we kill them and then break this bone totem, it will actually set them free. Because if we had gone a little farther up this mine shaft, we'll actually run into a bunch of the enchanted miners who basically ask us to go do this. So if you want to just jump the gun a little bit, you can destroy the totem, which frees the undead. You can have a short conversation with them a little later, and then they all die. But basically, they're just thankful that they're not undead slaves anymore. So to the right, we can actually find Drexus in a cage. Now, Drexus will explain part of what I just mentioned earlier, that their leader, Satacondris, actually wants to learn about the Bloodstones. However, the Immaculates have no intention of actually helping them. They're betraying the goblins as well, because that's what the Immaculates do. So they've actually locked up their goblins of the mine's leader, Drexus, the local leader, and several of his goblins in a cage, and they plan on turning them into undead slaves as well. Real quick, the side quest for Lawrence actually wants us to deal with the goblin problem. So if we kill Drexus, we can get Drexus's head, and then before we continue on with this quest, if you want the reward for that, you need to go back to Lawrence immediately and turn it in, for reasons I'll get to later, but I just wanted to mention that right here in this part of the walkthrough, that if you want the proper reward for that side quest, you need to kill Drexus, get his head, and then immediately go back afterwards to Silverglen and turn that quest in. Because once we've resolved all of those things, we will have also learned from these conversations, which I've been holding back a little bit from, is the Immaculates have been raising something that has been referred to by a couple different names in the conversations up to this point. Hell Lords is my personal favorite. Actually, they're Death Knights. So, the Immaculates in this mine have been raising Death Knights who are on patrol in the mine shafts we're about to get to. Thing is, the Death Knights are invulnerable. You cannot damage them in any way. So you're basically forced with sneaking past them because you will not win this fight. Your teleporter pyramids also don't work, so you have to sneak through here in this mine. Like legit, there is no way to kill these Death Knights. With that in mind, the easiest thing to do here is if you have a character who has the invisibility spell from the Scoundrel tree, is to send them up ahead by themselves, by turning them invisible and not even bothering to sneak, sending them through these mine shafts until you get to the way shrine slightly farther along the mine shafts. And then, using your other 3 party members, send them to the way shrine at the very entrance to the mine, and then click on that way shrine and have them teleport between the 2 way shrines. Because you can do that, but you cannot use your teleporter pyramids or rift travel in here. But using that method, you can get basically your whole party past the main bulk of the Death Knight patrols pretty easily. Eventually, once we navigate all these Death Knight patrols, we're going to come across a locked temple door. So once we get to the door, and again, you would have known this, I didn't want to mention it right off the bat, but you need a password for this door. The password, if you were paying close attention to the conversations earlier, is actually the goblin leader's name, Satacondris. So that's literally the password you need to choose for the door, is the word Satacondris. Now, once we get inside the temple, we will find a Death Knight forge where they have been forging these invulnerable Death Knights from. And once we go a little farther past this forge, Leandra pops up, stops our whole party. If your entire party isn't present for this conversation, she teleports all of them in. And then Leandra explains that the reason she has been killing things in mass to power these bloodstones she's been creating is to make the Death Knights, because the Death Knights are immune to damage. They cannot be harmed. So with that in mind, her end goal for bringing about the void that we saw in our end of time bits of the game, the void dragon is looming, threatening to bring about the actual end of time. In order to bring about that fate, Leandra is planning on using these Death Knights in mass to basically make an unstoppable army that marches and kills all. Now Leandra is controlling the Death Knights by basically adding little bits of her blood to the magic with which she is creating them, making the Death Knights loyal to her. So she explains all this, now that we found the forge anyway, and she takes this opportunity to do the standard villain thing where they're like, now my Death Knight shall destroy you while I leave, and don't bother to confirm that you died. So, from here, the Death Knights in the room, she raises 4 of them. No, it's 3, sorry. And you have to run away, and you will eventually get to a Mirror of Astarte at the end of the path that you are running away from the Death Knights from. So this Mirror of Astarte will let you teleport to other areas, which you will then be safe from the Death Knights. The rest of this part of the video is basically just going to be exploration and learning some lore through environmental storytelling. From jumping around from the Mirrors of Astarte through this ruins, we can go to the crypt, the High Priest Chapel, and the entryway. So if you want to leave immediately, you can just go to the entryway because that's where the actual exit is. Now, however, if we go to the crypt, we can meet a ghost of the priests that used to actually occupy this temple when it was used as an actual temple. This priest will actually explain that this temple is a temple to Astarte, the goddess of source. Now, this is the first mention we have of Astarte being an actual goddess, and I'll get into the lore implications of that towards the end of this video. I will take some time to talk about that, but we'll scroll over it for now. In addition to this, if we go to the High Priest chambers through the Mirror of Astarte, we can actually find Leandra's little safe haven that she's been using. And we can get a lot of more background information on her relationships with some of the other characters that we meet, but most importantly, we learn from her journal here that she had actually created a spell to make the Death Knights vulnerable to damage, because just in case they ever tried to turn on her specifically because, like, say the blood part of the spell failed or something and they weren't loyal to her, she's been working on a spell to basically kill them just in case. So this spell takes her actual spell and combines it with some of her blood and uses that to make Death Knights vulnerable to attack. So we'll find the spell half of this right here in this little safe haven area. Now, as this safe haven area might tell you, and all of the fire raining down around us, something I didn't mention up to this point is the reason we wanted to turn Drexus's head into Lawrence immediately after getting it is that once we get to this part, once we have that conversation with Leandra at the entrance to this temple that we were just in, the entire mine gets flooded with lava and is no longer traversable. So once we escape this area, it's done. There's no way out. Once we get the information about Astarte and the information from Leandra's little safe chamber room, we can then head to the entryway through the Mirror of Astarte and traverse the burning path down to another mirror that will actually let us leave. So once we are out of the mines, again, they are completely gone. So we can go back to town and turn in our side quests. If you waited to talk to Lawrence until this point, he will basically refuse to give you a reward because, the mines are destroyed. However, you can help him get his proverbial comeuppance for basically selling out his mine to not only the Rot, but also the Goblins. You can complete Nadia's side quest to help with that as well, and then Brandon just gives you a flat reward if you give him the Tenebrium that he requested. Lastly, we can go speak to Icara after we have now found out what Leandra was doing in the Luculla Mines. Icara will be like, oh my god, she's raising Death Knights. They haven't been seen since Rex's reign, and, when the Source Hunters destroyed all of them the last time. Death Knights before this were actually weak to some things. They were still very strong warriors, but they weren't like literally immune to damage. Apparently being empowered through the Bloodstones is what specifically has made them invulnerable. So just something to keep in mind. That's why they're so strong in this particular game. And lastly, Icara, now that we have this information and we were basically able to figure out what was going on in the Luculla Mines, mentions that basically we need more information about what they're planning to do next. And she sends you to infiltrate the Immaculates, because the part of Silver Glen that I did not mention is that the Silver Glen town is actually a hub of Immaculate activity, because the Conduit came there, cured several miners of the rot. So basically they see this woman and this religion as like this huge savior organization that's doing amazing things for them. But of course, as we know, they're actually lunatics who are murdering people en masse. But the villagers don't know that. They just know that these people are working literal miracles, basically, to heal miners sick with the rot. So we can use this to our advantage, as Icara mentions, and infiltrate them, which we will get into in our next episode. So next episode, we'll be following that Infiltrate the Immaculates questline and seeing where that leads us. So that is going to wrap the story part of this up. I did, like I mentioned, want to talk a little bit about Astarte. So she's mentioned as the goddess of source. So two things with that. If you've played Original Sin 2, you know that technically there's only 7 gods of Rivellon, or 7 known gods as far as the ones that came from the race of Eternals. Now, Astarte is seen at the very least working with the 7. They actually mentioned in one of the cinematics from earlier that the gods, when they made the god box, specifically chose to put it in the first garden with Astarte. The thing is, and the reason I bring this up, is that when we speak to the Weaver of Time earlier, she actually mentions that when she saw Astarte, she didn't think Astarte was a full-blown goddess. So it seems, in my speculative opinion on this particular thing, that Astarte is less of a full-blown goddess and more of a representation of a facet of the cosmic powers, so to speak. She's basically like the representation of Source physically. She's like an avatar of it. That's how I personally like to think of it, especially seeing as the Weaver literally says that she doesn't think Astarte is a full-blown goddess the way the actual 7 gods are. So just something to keep in mind. Whether or not she is or isn't shouldn't really make a difference to this story, or frankly the overall lore of Divinity. Because as we know, these 7 gods are actually phonies anyway, and it's very possible that Astarte is more of an actual force of creation of sorts, rather than a god in the traditional sense of how the 7 gods came to power. So she might be more of a representation of an actual facet of the universe, so to speak. That speculation aside, that's going to wrap up the video, guys. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. I hope you stick around for the next episode. If you did, be so kind as to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But thank you so much for watching, and have a fantastic day.